of time, then I will say a few words on this project before handing over to Jennifer. And again, if someone online wants to interrupt, just unmute and jump in. I will leave some time also in the end of this. This is the second project within these themes.
Helena, sorry to interrupt. Can I add something? I was interested in this topic you mentioned in regards to output versus outcome, which we do see quite often in the projects. When we look at the, you mentioned the outcome versus requirements. Most of the time, the challenge is that you work in a scaled agile organization, lots of different teams working together to deliver sort of a solution. And I think the challenges will be that from a management point of view, they try to understand perhaps the value, but the challenge is since it's different in different teams, they try to put it in a sort of a scope when we talk about the value for the whole project consists of many teams in between. So what I'm trying to say is that to understand the value for each of teams, it's sort of difficult for the organization, and most of the time we end up in measuring things instead. So this has been one of the behavior I have seen. And yeah, I don't have any solution for that, but I think this is a really interesting topic that, of course, we need to focus more on the outcomes of things, but at the same time, how do we know that we get right value from each teams which together deliver a big product, so to say. I don't know if I make sense, but yeah.
Yes, you make perfect sense, and this is what makes large-scale development really difficult, but also really interesting. I mean, it would be easy if we had one team, one feature, or one product. I don't know, but the challenge and the interesting part is exactly what the software center companies consist of. That's the large scale. So I completely agree with you. It's also in between teams. And to add, I mean, the whole notion of value, what we often find in a discussion on value is that you might have lots of assumptions in the company what constitutes customer value, but you're not really the ones to determine. It's the customer, and you need to find mechanisms to learn and detect any change out there, because value is not stable, it's dynamic too. So
exactly. And also when we talk about customers, for us working in a big project with the scaled agile, who is the customer for us? It's not, you don't have a real customer in a sense that you can say you can communicate with. It can be a stakeholder, someone, let's say a product manager or some solution owner, or someone else who actually sort of a customer in this case, but you are sort of far away from the real, if it's a customer that actually wants to use the product, because we are trying to break things down into different teams. And yeah, so it's a challenge in regards also to customer, to understand customer and values when you don't really have a real customer in a sense that you can communicate with.
Yes. Thanks a lot, and we'll continue the discussion, and it would be great to work more on the topic with you. I will say a few words on the project called Strategic Ecosystem-Driven R&D Management. This is the second project in the theme run by me and Jan. Also, it has been there for many years, but this project has shifted quite dramatically, I would say, and that has to do with digitalization, digital transformation. It used to be very ecosystem oriented, but then mostly in regards to strategies for building relationship and with whom do I interact with. So more on the creation of a business ecosystem, as well as understanding how do I within the products, every product has an innovation layer, more innovative functionality, the differentiating layer, and then more commodity. And we spent a lot of time in the beginning working with strategies for how to deal with commodity. You want to have someone else deal with it. You want to not spend your resources, and you do not want to have it cost. And how do I then shift my resources to the more differentiating? So that was the start. Now it is very much about strategic guidance for how to operate in new ecosystems. The whole notion of new business models, new businesses, digital services, I mean, it has, and you know this, it has shifted the ways in which everything works. There are new partners popping up, new competitors, new everything, and new technologies. So that's, and if you look at this, and many of you saw this already, but when we say digitalization, we mean software, data, and AI. And where the software center companies used to be was the red, that is today commodity, and everything green is where things happen. Not to say that the red is not important, and of course things happen also there, but you don't typically distinguish in the red parts anymore. You distinguish with what is here marked as green. And also if you look at this, it has a business model dimension where you typically used to have a more transactional model for the mechanics and electronics. The more software you go, typically the more continuous, the more subscription-based, the more something else you have the opportunity to do in terms of business models and revenue. There is an ecosystem dimension to this transformation. There are new partners coming in. You need to really re-evaluate who your competitors are. I think many of the companies have experienced a situation where a company comes in and they really offer a point solution like, we solve your data problems. So what strategies do you take? Do you engage with them, or do you engage with your existing ecosystem to keep them out? I mean, all kinds of interesting dynamics with regards to the business ecosystem. And then with every new technology, you also typically have a new process or new ways to work in. So this is what we experience: the DevOps, the data ops, the ML ops, the AI ops, the biz ops, the whatever ops. But there are new practices employed in all of the software center companies. In the project, and just 2 sprints ago, we published this framework, which then basically outlines what we see being the main dimensions in which companies need to evolve when moving towards more of a digital business. So in the middle, you have the business model dimension, where everyone used to be primarily product sales. Of course, there was service revenue, but it was still limited. And the more you move, the higher you go in the stairway, the more service-oriented, or you could say data-driven, or you use digital assets more and more for each step. Where we see the software center companies being right now is, I would say, on the 3rd step primarily. Everyone is looking into complementary services. Everyone is looking into how do I make use of the data I collect to really enhance the experience for a customer. And then you can look at, so what is the next step? Well, that's the step where you make use of the aggregated data. You can, as a fleet owner, really compare yourself towards other fleet owners, or you could provide one customer with insights on other customers. So you get something that goes beyond the product or me as one customer myself, or the product itself. Something in addition, some insight, some maybe life cycle management, something that adds to the existing product. As I mentioned before, we also see the software companies being increasingly interested in the 4th step here, where you basically monetize based on how well you fulfill your customer KPIs. So if I am AB Volvo, I would monetize on the number of successful deliveries on time, for example. So that's where we see companies move towards. And then the final step is not yet prevalent in software-centered companies, but something that everyone, I think, is thinking about, maybe exploring and looking for ways to accomplish. It's where you collect data from your existing customers and you sell it to someone else. So for example, with vehicles collecting all kinds of road conditioning data, maybe someone else would be interested in paying for that. Sensors collecting all kinds of weather data, maybe someone would want to buy that. So there are all kinds of opportunities, but there are lots of challenges involved. But that's where many companies are at least interested in finding ways forward. In Sprint 22, we focused on primarily innovation and development of new digital offerings. We looked at key challenges. We outlined patterns we see in the companies that make innovation difficult. We developed a framework for the different types of offerings that we see. And then we have something we call a value taxonomy, and I will show you a little bit of all of these, but not to dive into each and every one, but some of the key challenges are listed here. I mentioned very often software-centered companies have been quite technology-driven in the mindset, with all rights. But the more service-oriented you go and the more innovation within the digital space, you feel, the ones we work with feel, we need to be more user-centric. But that's not a trivial shift. So that is one of the biggest challenges we experienced. Also, there are lots of very effective and well-established methods on how to develop products. And everyone, all the member companies here, I mean, it's not the top leader in the world, you are among the top 3 to 5 companies within your domain. I mean, really super well-established companies. So you know all about product development and methods and processes for how to do this. But for innovation and services, you need something in addition. And that was the Gartner, that was the lean thinking, it was the design thinking. But it's not that easy to translate it into a B2B, large-scale, agile system development context of a safety-critical system. So that's another one. We have talked many years about cross-functional teams. When you do service development with an end-to-end experience for a customer, companies run into a situation where you need to go beyond cross-functional and more towards some cross-organizational. You might need other units outside your own closest world. You might even need suppliers or someone in your ecosystem to work with you. It is much more than just a cross-functional team. And you definitely need sales. I told you already about the challenges with prioritizing, testing and validating. So of all of these ideas, how do we pick, how do we validate with customers? Many companies find themselves in a situation where they still spend lots of time on Horizon 1 innovation. That's typically the already existing. We could also say legacy or commodity, but to add to something already there, rather than the Horizon 3, something completely new, beyond the current, a new revenue stream. And that's, of course, where you would want to at least spend more of your time. And the patterns, and sorry for all the text, but I will try to explain them, and then you can get the slides and you can read a little bit about them. But the gold plating pattern is still there. That's when you want to develop the complete, the perfect, the optimal, the everything before you deploy. And that is, of course, the biggest risk is that you waste resources, and in the end, you provide something that might not really add the customer value that you intended. But that mindset is still a challenge, also in the innovation space. pink cloud pattern, we call it. It means that you let your assumptions drive innovation. You don't go out and validate. And of course, the biggest risk is that your own assumption is outdated. Maybe they work, but they are. We have an OPAB pattern. That refers to the pattern we still see when allocating resources. So here, many companies find themselves in a situation where innovation gets little attention. It is too easy to have people working on the typical. And innovation never fits the organization. It needs to, that's something beyond. So we had many teams telling us that, you know, this idea is great, but we are not responsible. It doesn't fit our organization or role. And that's the typical case. New things don't necessarily fit, but it needs a place. So the risk here is to have the existing structure basically hinder you from innovating. And then the final one, the whack-a-mole. I don't know how many of you know the game, but there is always someone or something popping up. And as soon as you have managed to deal with one of those people popping up and stopping you, there is a new one or something else. But this was the typical, the blocking functions, and maybe it's related to the previous one because it's difficult to fit this into the existing organization. So those were the patterns. And they are not unique. I mean, they span every domain. I think they are applicable for everyone, and something we don't necessarily solve, but we need to be aware and we need to work on them. This is the framework that we developed during the sprint to visualize the different types of value that you are actually providing your customers. There is product-oriented value, typically related to performance, maybe to maintenance, those very product-centric value offerings. These are very often what customers are used to get for free. That's why it has the commodity mark, because even if you would want to monetize, you don't really, because everyone expects it for free. And even if you monetize, it doesn't go beyond the existing revenue streams necessarily. There is outcome-oriented value, which is then more on the, I mentioned, insights, maybe on efficiency, quality, productivity, device, asset, lifecycle management, something in addition, something a little bit more outcome-oriented. And here you see a mix. Some of these services could be paid for already with the product as in the package, then you don't really monetize. Or you could have customers pay for it separately. So we see both. Comparative value is where you actually then start adding value that goes beyond the previous two, where customers all of a sudden can compare themselves, get a better understanding for how they are doing. This we placed as differentiating, because here you can actually add, here you can do something new, here you can even have new revenue coming in. It goes beyond the existing. And then finally, it stays within innovation, and we are not really there yet, but there is potential. That's when, again, you collect data from one, monetize with the other. That is a value that definitely goes beyond the existing and even opens up a new customer segment. So this is more to illustrate, because when we talk services and digital offerings, it means very many different things, and you provide very many different types of value within the service digital offering space. So we wanted to detail it a little bit. to also have more of a discussion on how to monetize and when not to monetize. The challenge is, of course, that most of the effort, at least when you start, is spent very much within the commodity space, and that brings very little revenue. But still. We did develop, and I won't walk through this, and everyone who is interested can get it from me, but we wanted to give a few examples, so then you see value provided to stakeholders. Those are the 4 steps in the previous slide. And then we exemplified what these could look like depending on what it is you provide your customer. So you could sometimes only, the value consists of you visualize something, you visualize the status of something. That could be, for example, a dashboard. You could provide insights, for example, then preventive maintenance. And then we also detailed whether it goes typically as bundled and if it is for free. So it has all kinds of dimensions, this little taxonomy. You could even recommend actions. That would be then something even more advanced. So predictive maintenance. Then you start to move from more of a static offering to something of a more evolutionary character, because recommendations, they build on the situation right now and it changes over time. That is typically something you unbundle because you want to monetize it separately. And then the last one would be more of the automated actions, which is also the most advanced step. So the taxonomy provides examples where we give an example. We distinguish between a static and an evolving offering, whether is it bundled or unbundled, and whether or not you can monetize it or if customers expect it for free, based on what we learned. The color coding, the green is the ones we observed in at least one, but typically multiple companies. The orange is either we heard about it or one or more companies planned, they had concrete plans for it. And then the red, they are not yet observed. And it is more our reasoning or examples from outside on what they could look like. But just to give a feel. And we do have a publication that is to be presented in late August. So there is a paper including this taxonomy and the previous framework. So if anyone would want to read more about it, there is a paper that can be easily shared. Publications, again, I'm happy to share. And then going forward, we propose to look into, so we had a workshop recently where primarily the automotive companies joined, but it was intended for them. They described a situation in which you, as an incumbent, you would wish to buy certain standard components from someone else. I mean, commodity components. You know that as a company, I spend far too much resources on it. I would want to buy it. But then there is actually no one providing what you need. It's really difficult, even if you would want to let go of commodity, to actually find someone else providing you that commodity that integrates with the system, with the APIs, with everything you have. So what you end up is in a situation where you then do it yourself anyway, because I'm best in the market. I mean, why would I, as an incumbent, engage with everyone else to make this happen if I do it easier and cheaper myself? But you would want to. So what we notice, and that's the third here, we talk a lot about the cross-ecosystem innovation. We would want to have others play along. We would even want them to take over parts of what we do. But there is no one there. there are no real incentives to get that going. So support for deciding when and where to collaborate, when and where not to collaborate, and when to partner with existing and or new ecosystem stakeholders, and when not. So those types of strategies and reasoning. And this is basically repeated then in the deliverables. So as a common theme, and to summarize and before handing over to Jennifer, the cross-ecosystem innovation is what we feel the most interesting, also the most maybe difficult thing to get going, but absolutely necessary when developing new digital innovative services that add value that goes beyond the existing products. So that's where we would want to spend time during next sprint. And with that, if I do, Jennifer, are you in the meeting?
Mm-hmm.
Good.
I can share here.
Because then you can share from your end. Yep. Are there questions on this project?
Helena, Jens, good.
Hey, Jens.
Good presentation. Your last comment here is super interesting with sharing cross ecosystems. From our side, Grundfos has partnered up with various different ecosystems providers like Siemens and others. I think the difficult thing, I attended a course once where the professor said, whoever owns the platform owns the customers. The difficult thing with cross ecosystem things, at least I think, is that the business model around sharing data and sharing customers and so on it's quite difficult to share the business model around that. Who takes part of which, or who takes the piece of the pie? Who owns the customers and so on? Have you had any discussions or anything on that?
Yes and no. We have had many people share similar challenges as the ones you share with me now. So there has been a discussion. I think it falls within what I refer to maybe lack of incentives. So the business model, I mean, yes, it is critical. I know that there are experiments, you could say, where you try with one partner to get a feel for how to implement or how to work in a new way, like with a new business model. I don't have any really good example, Jens. I can only say that what you share now is exactly what is part of us proposing this focus, because we don't see the incentives. If I go back to the workshop that I mentioned, we had AB Volvo in that workshop, who is an extremely strong player within the ecosystem. They would wish for a situation similar to what I refer to when saying cross-ecosystem innovation and collaboration, but they have difficulties in realizing it because they are way ahead. And you don't engage if you yourself find yourself in a position that is above or premium or better than someone else. So you really need to find the incentives for engaging cross-ecosystem. I don't know, I don't think I answered your question, but it is a key part of what we would want to look into. And we had discussions also with you, initial ones, that we hope to explore.
Okay, thanks for the answer. Look forward to discussing this again.
Is there anyone else with a question?
I would like to ask one thing. I think you're quite right about the finding ways to partner up with people who are experts in making that commodity. Mm-hmm. But there's different ways of partnering. There's also I think this ecosystem thing is another sort of dimension in some way. This ecosystem like Siemens MindSphere. But then there's also the partnering up with very small startups that does something. Yes. And I find that is extremely hard for, at least for Grundfos, can see that we have a really hard time doing that. And how do you see that fitting in? Because there's both the one end where you want somebody to take that commodity development, but there's also the other end where you want somebody to deliver your innovation, basically.
Yeah. And I think that is also really interesting because, of course, first of all, I think all companies experience a situation in which you take different roles in different ecosystems. So if I know Grundfos, in one ecosystem, you might want to be the preferred partner, while in maybe another ecosystem, you are the key player. I mean, you really take on different roles depending on what we are talking about in terms of product or functionality or service or whatever it is. And then we have exactly the situation you describe. Every product or every system has it has the commodity that you want to maybe get rid of or at least share. It has the differentiating where you wouldn't want anyone to mess up. You would really want to keep it in-house. And an example there is, of course, many years back, software development was not a key competence in many of the software-centric companies. It was outsourced. It was someone else bringing software to you. Then we realized, software is super important. We want it in-house. Now most companies have software development in-house. And then you realize, but we need the AI skills and the data scientists. So that's what you then say. There is this one competence or maybe key component sometimes more on the innovation side or at least new technology side that you don't have, but you really need. And so that's a completely different ecosystem, you could say, or at least it needs different strategies. So yes, so here we put a focus on maybe more on the commodity part, but definitely the strategies, they cross all of these three and they look very different depending on who you want to engage with and on what. And I think the similar thing goes for innovation in the sense that you need the understanding of when to engage and with whom, but actually also when not. So it's sort of the same question, but in relation to commodity versus innovation, for example. And when it comes to innovation as an incumbent, if you partner up with a small startup, I guess you would also want an understanding of, okay, as soon as something has proven successful, how do I bring it into my offering rather than someone else? So it's a huge, this project comprises many different questions. This is part of it, but no workshop so far in my experience has been able to focus on one or two, so it goes broad.